The sky at sunset was dark and ominous, its colors signaling something unsettling. The beach was eerily quiet, with only the sound of waves crashing against the shore and the wind blowing across, blending with the cold air of autumn. But what was strange was that despite summer having passed, the water still felt unnaturally cold, as if it had never known warmth. Chris, a young man from New York City, had come to this beach to escape the clamor of city life. Seeking a quiet place to find some peace, he had heard of this beach from a friend who told him of a strange power lurking within the deep waters, the story of a mysterious shipwreck and how the spirits of the sailors never left, still haunting the waters. Although Chris felt a slight unease at hearing such stories, he decided to leave his home in New York and visit the place. From the moment he set foot on the beach, a strange chill settled over him. Even though the sun hadn't fully set, there was an odd silence around him. No loud waves, no birds, nothing but the sound of his own breath. He found a secluded spot near a rocky outcrop, sat down, and gazed out at the sea. He pushed aside the unease in his mind, focusing on finding some peace, but just as he settled on the cold sand, something strange happened. The light from the lamp illuminating the beach flickered, and in that moment the sea seemed to shake. The waves crashing harder than usual. A strange feeling surged within Chris, like he was being watched from the water. Suddenly he heard it again, a deep breath, almost like a whisper, coming from the depths of the sea. It wasn't an ordinary sound. It was as though someone or something was calling to him from below. Chris froze for a moment, his heart racing, but as soon as he turned his head toward the water, the sound faded. He stood up quickly, walking to the edge of the water, trying to shake off the strange sensation that was creeping over him. But as his feet touched the cold, wet sand, he felt an overwhelming pull, something drawing him in, telling him to come closer. And then, just as he was about to turn back, he saw it. A faint shadow rose from the water, moving with an unnatural speed. It wasn't a person, but something far darker, an ethereal form that seemed to glide across the surface of the sea. Chris stood, paralyzed, his eyes fixed on it as it moved closer, as though it were heading straight toward him. His heart raced as he tried to take a step back, but the shadow kept coming, swirling around the water like it had a mind of its own. He couldn't explain it. It was as if the very sea itself had come alive, and it was coming for him. He turned and fled, stumbling toward the shore, but the feeling of being followed never left him. Chris didn't know what he had seen that day, but he knew one thing for sure. Something was not right with this beach. Something had awoken. And it was only a matter of time before he would uncover the truth of what lay beneath those cold waters. The days that followed felt like a fevered dream for Chris. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadowy figure rising from the depths of the sea. It wasn't just a fleeting image. It lingered, haunting him in his waking moments. The air around the beach was colder now, and the eerie silence seemed to intensify each time he returned to the shore. Despite the growing unease gnawing at him, Chris couldn't shake the need to understand what was happening. He began to dig deeper into the history of the beach, visiting the local library, searching old records, and asking the few locals who were brave enough to talk. Most of them avoided him when he mentioned the beach, but one elderly woman, Mrs. Holloway, took pity on him and shared an unsettling tale. Many years ago, this beach was home to a shipwreck, Mrs. Holloway explained in a shaky voice, her eyes darting nervously. A merchant ship, the Evergreen, went down in a storm. The crew, they say they made a pact before setting out, a pact with something in the water, something ancient. Chris leaned in, sensing the gravity of her words. They say the spirits of the crew never left. Their souls are trapped beneath the waves, cursed to wander forever, and every few years find someone who comes too close to the water, and they drag them under so their souls can replace the ones that have been lost. Chris's heart raced as the woman's words settled in. He couldn't help but think of the shadow he had seen, the eerie whisper he had heard. The curse she spoke of felt too real, too close to the truth. That night, unable to rest, Chris returned to the beach, determined to confront whatever force had been haunting him. The moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the ocean, and the usual peaceful sound of the waves was replaced by a deep, resonant hum, almost like a chant from the depths. He stood by the water's edge, watching the sea swell and crash, when he heard it again, the unmistakable whisper. It was faint, but this time it was clearer. Come closer, it beckoned, a low, soft voice that seemed to come from the very core of the ocean. Without thinking, Chris stepped into the water, the coldness biting at his skin, sending shivers through his spine. The water seemed to welcome him, rising higher, tugging at his legs, pulling him deeper into the sea. He felt a strange compulsion to follow the sound, to let it guide him further into the depths. Suddenly, the water surged around him, the waves rising higher, the wind picking up. Chris struggled to maintain his footing, but the water kept pulling him in as though it had a mind of its own. He heard the whisper again, louder this time, almost as if it was speaking directly into his ear. "Join us, Chris. Join the crew of the Evergreen." The voice was now unmistakably a call. A command. Chris's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the gravity of the situation. He had been drawn into something far beyond his understanding. He couldn't fight it. The pull of the sea was stronger than anything he had ever experienced. But just as he felt himself beginning to drown, the water suddenly released its grip and Chris was thrown back onto the shore. Gasping for air, his body trembling, he looked up to see something horrifying. In the distance, the silhouette of a ship appeared on the horizon, the Evergreen with its sails torn, its hull barely visible in the mist. The ghostly ship seemed to hover just above the water, its crew moving silently on the deck. They were figures of shadow, their faces twisted in agony, eyes glowing with the same eerie light that Chris had seen in his visions. The whispers faded, but Chris knew that this wasn't over. He had just encountered the beginning of something far darker than he could have ever imagined. He stumbled back, horrified but unable to turn away. The curse of the sea had marked him. The night after the ghostly vision of the Evergreen, Chris couldn't sleep. His mind raced, replaying every detail of what he had seen. He tried to rationalize it, convince himself it was a figment of his imagination, but deep down he knew something had shifted. The connection between the curse, the ship, and the whispers had become undeniable. Chris couldn't stay away from the beach. The pull was magnetic. Despite his fear, he knew he had to uncover more about the mysterious ship. He needed answers. The curse, the ghostly crew, and the strange whispers calling him, they were no coincidence. This was no ordinary haunt. It was a force that had been haunting the waters for centuries, and Chris was now caught in its grip. The next evening, he returned to the beach just before sunset. The air was thick with tension, the sky painted with ominous hues of red and purple. The waves were crashing more violently than usual, as if the ocean itself was warning him. Yet his feet moved forward, carrying him toward the water. As he stood on the shore, a thick fog rolled in from the sea. The faint sound of bells, like those on a ship, could be heard above the roar of the waves. It was a sound that sent shivers down Chris's spine. He looked out into the mist, his breath caught in his throat. Suddenly, through the fog, the shape of a ship began to materialize, the Evergreen, but this time it wasn't an illusion. It was real. Its wooden hull creaked under the weight of time, its masts towering above the water like twisted skeletal remains. There was no sound of the crew, no wind in the sails, but the ship was there, anchored just off the shore, motionless yet ominously present. Chris's heart pounded as he approached the edge of the water. The whispers began again, clearer this time, reverberating through his chest like a drumbeat. "Come closer, Chris," the voice urged, this time filled with more urgency. "Join us." He froze, his mind torn between fear and curiosity. He knew he couldn't resist the pull much longer. With every wave that lapped against the shore, his body became heavier, as if the ocean itself was urging him to cross the boundary. Against his better judgment, Chris stepped into the water. It was colder than before, biting into his skin like needles. The further he walked, the deeper the water rose. His feet sunk into the sand, making it harder to move, but he couldn't turn back now. The moment he reached the ship's hull, he felt an overwhelming presence. He was no longer alone. Figures began to materialize along the deck, slowly moving toward him. They were indistinct at first, but as they drew closer, their forms solidified. The ghostly sailors wore tattered uniforms, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes filled with eternal sorrow. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world to drag him into their world. Chris's heart raced and panic surged through him. "What do you want with me?" he shouted, his voice shaking. One of the figures, the captain, stepped forward, his eyes glowing a pale blue. "You've come for the truth," he said, his voice deep and haunting. "But now you are one of us. We are the lost souls of the Evergreen, bound by a pact we never understood, and now you are part of it." The captain's voice echoed in Chris's mind, the words sending a cold chill through his veins. Chris tried to step back, but the water had become thick, pulling him toward the ship. The figures reached out, their cold hands grazing his skin, and in an instant, Chris felt the weight of their cursed existence pressing on him. "You cannot leave," the captain's voice whispered. "You have been chosen, you must take our place." Chris fought with everything he had, but it was futile. The sea had claimed him. The whispers became louder, and the figures, now in full form, surrounded him, trapping him in their ethereal grip. As the water rose higher, engulfing him, the ship seemed to come to life, its wooden creaks filling the air. It felt like the very ocean itself was swallowing him whole. The faces of the ghostly crew surrounded him, their eyes cold and empty. They had all been bound by the same curse, trapped between the living and the dead, unable to move on. Chris was pulled beneath the waves, the cold darkness swallowing him whole. But just before he lost consciousness, he heard the captain's final words, "Now you belong to the sea like us." The night after the ghostly vision of the Evergreen, Chris couldn't sleep. His mind raced, replaying every detail of what he had seen. He tried to rationalize it, convince himself it was a figment of his imagination, but deep down he knew something had shifted. The connection between the curse, the ship, and the whispers had become undeniable. Chris couldn't stay away from the beach. The pull was magnetic. Despite his fear, he knew he had to uncover more about the mysterious ship. He needed answers. The curse, the ghostly crew, and the strange whispers calling him, they were no coincidence. This was no ordinary haunt. It was a force that had been haunting the waters for centuries, and Chris was now caught in its grip. The next evening, he returned to the beach just before sunset. The air was thick with tension, the sky painted with ominous hues of red and purple. The waves were crashing more violently than usual, as if the ocean itself was warning him. Yet his feet moved forward, carrying him toward the water. As he stood on the shore, a thick fog rolled in from the sea. A faint sound of bells like those on a ship could be heard above the roar of the waves. It was a sound that sent shivers down Chris's spine. He looked out into the mist, his breath caught in his throat. Suddenly, through the fog, the shape of a ship began to materialize, the Evergreen, but this time it wasn't an illusion. It was real. Its wooden hull creaked under the weight of time, its masts towering above the water like twisted skeletal remains. There was no sound of the crew, no wind in the sails, but the ship was there, anchored just off the shore, motionless yet ominously present. Chris's heart pounded as he approached the edge of the water. The whispers began again, clearer this time, reverberating through his chest like a drumbeat. "Come closer, Chris," the voice urged, this time filled with more urgency. "Join us." He froze, his mind torn between fear and curiosity. He knew he couldn't resist the pull much longer. With every wave that lapped against the shore, his body became heavier, as if the ocean itself was urging him to cross the boundary. Against his better judgment, Chris stepped into the water. It was colder than before, biting into his skin like needles. The further he walked, the deeper the water rose. His feet sunk into the sand, making it harder to move, but he couldn't turn back now. The moment he reached the ship's hull, he felt an overwhelming presence. He was no longer alone. Figures began to materialize along the deck, slowly moving toward him. They were indistinct at first, but as they drew closer, their forms solidified. The ghostly sailors wore tattered uniforms, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes filled with eternal sorrow. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world to drag him into their world. Chris's heart raced and panic surged through him. "What do you want with me?" he shouted, his voice shaking. One of the figures, the captain, stepped forward, his eyes glowing a pale blue. "You've come for the truth," he said, his voice deep and haunting. "But now you are one of us. We are the lost souls of the Evergreen, bound by a pact we never understood, and now you are part of it." The captain's voice echoed in Chris's mind, the words sending a cold chill through his veins. Chris tried to step back, but the water had become thick, pulling him toward the ship. The figures reached out, their cold hands grazing his skin, and in an instant, Chris felt the weight of their cursed existence pressing on him. "You cannot leave," the captain's voice whispered. "You have been chosen, you must take our place." Chris fought with everything he had, but it was futile. The sea had claimed him. The whispers became louder, and the figures, now in full form, surrounded him, trapping him in their ethereal grip. As the water rose higher, engulfing him, the ship seemed to come to life, its wooden creaks filling the air. It felt like the very ocean itself was swallowing him whole. The faces of the ghostly crew surrounded him, their eyes cold and empty. They had all been bound by the same curse, trapped between the living and the dead, unable to move on. Chris was pulled beneath the waves, the cold darkness swallowing him whole. But just before he lost consciousness, he heard the captain's final words, "Now you belong to the sea like us." When Chris woke, the sensation of cold was overwhelming. His body felt like lead, weighed down by an unnatural heaviness, and his mind was a blur of fog. He tried to open his eyes, but the world around him was a swirling vortex of black and blue, as though he was still submerged under the ocean's depths. His lungs screamed for air, but the strange, suffocating pressure wouldn't allow him to breathe. It was as if the sea itself had claimed him, wrapped him in its cold embrace. He panicked, his heart racing, trying to remember what had happened. The ghostly crew, the captain, the whispers, they had pulled him under. He had been dragged beneath the surface, swallowed whole by the ship's cursed presence. But now, as he struggled to move, something began to shift. He realized he was no longer in the ocean. The water was gone, replaced by a chilling, clammy stillness. His hands were bound, his arms held tight by something unseen. He was in a dark room, the walls damp and rotting, and the air smelled of salt and decay. The ground beneath him was hard, and the only sound was his own ragged breath echoing in the silence. Chris's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of his memory. He was no longer alive in the way he had known. He had crossed over, he was in the same liminal space as the ghostly crew of the Evergreen. He had joined them. But why? What did it mean to be one of them? Could he escape this place, or was he doomed to wander this desolate, half-formed world for eternity? Before he could make sense of it all, a voice echoed through the darkness, low and familiar. "You have returned," the captain's voice said, as though it had always been there, waiting for him to awaken. "Welcome to your new home, Chris." Chris struggled to sit up, but his movements were stiff and unnatural. The chains, if they were chains, binding his wrists seemed to disappear into the blackness, extending beyond his sight. He was tethered to something deeper, something ancient. "What is this place?" Chris managed to croak, his voice weak but desperate. "This is the void," the captain replied. "The space between worlds, the place where souls like ours are caught. We are neither dead nor alive, but stuck, bound to this ship in the sea, for centuries. We have waited for a soul like yours to join us." The captain's voice seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding Chris like a fog. "You sought the truth, and now you are a part of it. There is no turning back." Chris's heart raced. "No, I won't stay here," he whispered, his voice trembling with defiance. "I won't be like you. You already are," the captain said, his tone colder now. "You were chosen just as we were. You crossed the threshold. And now you are bound by the curse of the Evergreen. The ship, the sea, they own us. There is no escape." Chris felt a pang of desperation. His eyes flickered around the room, his senses struggling to adjust. His surroundings were a blur, like a reflection in a shattered mirror, fragmented and distorted. He could see shadows, figures shifting just beyond his vision, but they weren't entirely solid. They were like echoes, fading in and out of existence. Suddenly, the figures materialized. The ghostly crew emerging from the darkness. Their faces were gaunt, hollow, like the shells of people who had once been alive, but had long since lost their humanity. They hovered around him, their eyes vacant, their bodies hovering just above the ground. There was no escape for them either. They were trapped just like him. "You'll learn soon enough," one of the sailors whispered, its voice hollow and unfeeling. "This is our fate. There's no end to it. We are the forgotten, the lost. But now you are one of us, and so you shall remain." Chris's heart sank. The hopelessness of the situation gripped him with a force stronger than anything he had ever experienced. This wasn't just a haunting or a curse, it was eternal. He had crossed over into a world from which there was no return. The captain moved closer, his ghostly form towering over Chris. "You will stay here with us as we have stayed, forever. The sea will claim more, and you will watch them all, just as we have. That is the price for knowing the truth." Chris closed his eyes, his thoughts swirling in a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. This was it. His life, his future, had been stolen from him. He was now part of something far older, far darker than he could have ever imagined. His fate was sealed. And then, just as he felt himself giving into despair, he heard it again, the whisper from the depths, "Find the ship's heart." The voice was faint, but it carried a weight, a promise of hope. He didn't know where it came from. But the words reverberated within him. "Find the ship's heart," he repeated to himself. Could there be a way out? Could he break free from this curse? But as the shadows closed in, Chris understood one thing. To break the curse of the Evergreen, he would have to face the truth. The heart of the ship was the key, but unlocking it might mean confronting something even darker than the ghostly crew. Chris could feel the cold seeping deeper into his bones, as though it were part of the ship's cursed presence. The words, the whisper rang through his mind over and over. Find the ship's heart. What did it mean? What was the heart of a ship, especially one that had been lost in time, cursed by the souls of sailors who had died centuries ago? The shadows around him shifted, ever watching, ever waiting. The ghostly figures that hovered near him, once distant and detached, were now closing in with an almost eager anticipation. They didn't speak, but their eyes followed him relentlessly, like hunters watching their prey. They were trapped in this limbo, and now so was he. But he couldn't stay in the dark any longer. He had to find the heart of the ship, whatever it was, and if that meant risking everything, then so be it. The captain, always lurking just beyond his reach, stood as a silent, menacing figure. His face was void of emotion, as though he had long ago lost the ability to feel anything, even the weight of regret. "You cannot escape, Chris," the captain's voice echoed through the room, vibrating the walls. "There is no way out. The ship has claimed you just as it claimed all of us. This is our fate." Chris clenched his fists, staring at the captain with defiance. "I'll find a way," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. "I won't be part of this anymore." The captain laughed, the sound hollow as though it came from far away. "You think you have a choice?" His eyes glinted in the dim light. "The ship is alive, Chris. It has no heart, only a hunger. And once it has claimed your soul, it will never let you go." Chris's chest tightened, but he didn't falter. He turned away from the captain, from the ghostly crew, and walked toward the ship's grand staircase, an ornate structure that seemed impossibly out of place in this place between worlds. The steps were covered in a strange mist, shifting as he climbed. The air grew colder as he ascended, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet as though protesting his every movement. At the top of the stairs, the corridor opened up into a massive chamber, filled with the sounds of whispers. Hundreds of ghostly voices murmured, their words indecipherable, as though the walls themselves were alive. And in the center of the room stood a large, imposing door, tall and ancient, covered in intricate carvings that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Chris approached the door, the whispers growing louder until they drowned out all other sounds, with a shaking hand. He reached for the handle, feeling a sharp coldness seep into his skin as he touched it. For a moment, nothing happened. The door remained motionless, its surface smooth, untouched by time. But then slowly the carvings began to glow, faint at first, then brighter, as though they were alive, reacting to his presence. The whispers intensified, and Chris could hear them clearly now. They were speaking his name, calling him. "Chris, come closer." He pushed the door open. And the sight that greeted him was both beautiful and terrifying. The room beyond was vast, stretching farther than he could see. The walls were lined with what appeared to be relics, artifacts from lost civilizations, each one glowing faintly with a strange energy. At the center of the room was a pedestal, and upon it rested an object, a heart-shaped crystal, glowing with a faint, eerie light. Chris's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the ship's heart. He moved toward it. His steps were slow, cautious. The air around the pedestal was thick with a strange, palpable energy, as though the very air was alive with power. He could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him, the whispers growing louder, more urgent. "You found it," the captain's voice echoed, distant but somehow close. "But it won't give you what you seek." Chris ignored him, reaching out toward the crystal. As his fingers brushed the surface, a surge of energy coursed through his body, filling him with a coldness deeper than anything he had felt before. He gasped, feeling his body freeze as the power of the crystal filled him. The room seemed to shift, and for a moment Chris was no longer in the ship. He was back in the ocean, sinking deeper, the cold water pulling him down. He could feel the ghostly hands of the crew reaching for him, dragging him into the depths. But then, as quickly as the sensation came, it was gone. He was back in the room, still standing before the crystal, but now the whispers had stopped. A new voice filled the silence, low and threatening. "You are not meant to control it," the voice said, its tone cold and final. "You cannot destroy what has been bound for centuries." Chris stepped back, panic flooding his veins. He had touched it, he had awakened it, and now there was no going back. The ship had always been alive, but now it was aware of him, and it was angry. The crystal pulsed brighter, its glow intensifying, and Chris could feel the ship beginning to shift, as though it were waking from a long, deep slumber. The whispers started again, but this time they were not calling him. They were warning him. "You are part of us now," they chanted. "You cannot leave." Chris stumbled backward, his heart pounding as the ship began to move. The floor beneath his feet shifted, groaning as the sea seemed to rise again, swallowing the room, and the walls closed in. The ship was alive. Now it had claimed him. The air grew thick and heavy around Chris as the walls of the room seemed to close in on him. His heart raced, every muscle in his body tensing with panic. The whispers of the ghostly crew grew louder, their voices now a chorus of rage, filled with anger and resentment. The ship was waking, and Chris knew that there was no escaping it. He turned back to the pedestal where the glowing crystal sat, pulsing with energy. It seemed to hum in time with his heartbeat, as though it had a life of its own, drawing him in. Power that surged through the room felt suffocating, an unseen force pushing against him from all sides. The ship's hunger was growing, and it wanted him, just as it had claimed the souls of its previous crew. Chris couldn't stay here. He couldn't let the ship claim him completely. Desperation surged through him, and he knew there was only one option: destroy the crystal. If he could somehow sever the connection between the ship and its cursed crew, he might be able to break free. But how? The ship was alive. The crystal was its heart, and removing it was no simple task. Every instinct told him to run, to flee from this place, but there was nowhere to hide. The ship was everywhere, inside him, around him, beneath him. It had already claimed his soul, and there was no escaping its grasp. As if reading his thoughts, the captain's voice echoed through the room. "You cannot destroy what has been bound for centuries," the captain warned, his tone dark and menacing. "The Evergreen is eternal, and you are part of it now." Chris gritted his teeth, trying to block out the captain's voice. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, but he refused to give in. He would not let this ship define his fate. Gathering every ounce of strength, Chris reached for the crystal, his fingers trembling as they brushed against its cold, pulsating surface. The moment his skin made contact with the crystal, a surge of energy rushed through him, and the room seemed to explode in a flash of light. His body was thrown backward, crashing into the stone floor, pain flooding his senses. For a moment, everything went black. When Chris opened his eyes, he found himself lying on the cold stone floor, gasping for air. The ship's presence had faded, but he could still feel its haunting influence, lingering in the air like a shadow. The walls of the room had stopped shifting, the whispers had quieted, and the crystal lay shattered on the floor, its light extinguished. He had done it. He had destroyed the heart of the ship, but the victory felt hollow. The ship was still there, still alive in some way, still clinging to the edges of his consciousness. The curse had been broken, but the damage had already been done. Chris could feel the weight of the ship's history pressing on him, its dark past a part of him now. As he slowly stood, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. The crew was gone. The ghostly figures that had once haunted the ship were nowhere to be seen. The room was silent, save for the sound of his own breathing. For the first time since he had boarded this cursed vessel, there was a stillness, but Chris knew that this wasn't the end. The Evergreen was more than a ship. It was a force, an entity that had been alive for centuries. And though he had broken its heart, its spirit would never be fully gone. It would haunt him as it had haunted so many others. With a final glance at the wreckage of the crystal, Chris turned and made his way out of the room, leaving the remains of the Evergreen behind him. The ship was dead, but its legacy, its curse, was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As he stepped outside into the night, the moon casting its cold light over the ocean, Chris knew that he hadn't truly escaped. The sea would always call to him, always pull at him, and the whispers of the crew would haunt his dreams. But he had broken free from the ship's physical grip, and for now, that was enough. Chris thought he had escaped. The ship was gone, the curse broken, and the haunting whispers had ceased. But the further he moved away from the Evergreen, the more he realized that the true cost of what he had done was only beginning to reveal itself. The ship's presence had marked him, had become a part of him. It was as if the sea itself had carved its name into his soul. For the days following his escape, Chris tried to return to normal. He moved away from the beach, found a small apartment in the city, and tried to put the past behind him. But every night, as he drifted into sleep, the memories of the ship and its ghostly crew would return, vivid and haunting. The whispers would call to him, and the image of the captain's cold, dead eyes would appear in his dreams. The curse had not been fully broken, it had only been postponed. One night, unable to sleep, Chris decided to return to the beach, hoping to find closure. He stood at the edge of the water, staring out into the dark, endless ocean. The waves crashed violently against the shore, and the wind howled through the trees. It was the same beach, the same place where he had witnessed the unimaginable, but this time it felt different. A presence lingered in the air, thick and oppressive. It was as if the ocean itself was alive, watching him, waiting for him to face what he had disturbed. "You cannot escape us," a voice whispered from the darkness, low and familiar. Chris froze, his blood running cold. It was the captain's voice, unmistakable, but there was something different about it now. It was as if the captain was no longer speaking from the ship, but from inside Chris's own mind. The whispers grew louder, and the water seemed to swirl around him, pulling him toward the depths. The sea was calling him back, drawing him closer to the cursed ship. The ship that had never truly left him. It had been waiting for the right moment to claim him once again. Suddenly, the sea before him began to churn. A shadow rose from the water, like the ghostly silhouette of the Evergreen, its sails torn and tattered, its hull broken and decayed. But it was not a vision this time. It was real. The ship had returned, and it was coming for him. Chris's heart raced as the ship began to move toward him, its massive form rising from the depths. He could see the ghostly crew standing on the deck, their eyes fixed on him. They had never left. They had been waiting for him to come back. "You cannot outrun your fate," the captain's voice echoed in his mind. "You are ours and always will be." Chris stumbled back, his feet slipping on the wet sand. The ship loomed closer, its sails flapping in the wind, its ghostly crew watching him with hollow eyes. He felt the weight of the curse pressing down on him, the weight of the souls trapped aboard the Evergreen. There was no escape. But then something shifted. Chris's body tensed, and he felt a surge of strength flood through him. For the first time since he had stepped aboard the Evergreen, he wasn't afraid. He was angry. He had faced the ship's curse, the ghostly crew, and the overwhelming darkness that had haunted him, and he was done running. "I refuse to be your prisoner any longer," Chris shouted, his voice steady and full of resolve. With those words, a strange energy pulsed through him. It was as if the sea itself responded to his defiance. The ship stopped moving, its ghostly crew frozen in place. The whispers faded into silence. The ocean, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, was still. "You cannot defeat us," the captain's voice hissed, but there was fear in it now. "You cannot destroy us," but Chris wasn't afraid anymore. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on the ship, on the ghostly crew. He raised his hands as if to break the curse once and for all. And in that moment, the ship seemed to tremble, as if it too recognized the finality of what was happening. The ground shook beneath his feet as the sea began to recede. The waves pulled away from the shore, the ship groaning and cracking as it was dragged back into the depths. The crew, their ghostly forms disintegrating, vanished into the mist. Chris stood there, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. The sea was calm once more. The ship was gone. The curse had been broken. And Chris, finally free, stood on the shore, the weight of the past lifted. The Evergreen and its crew would haunt him no more.